If you had stepped into a 13th century English village expecting solemn monks and quiet reflection, you might instead have found a crowd gathered in the square, laughing loudly at a punchline that required absolutely no interpretation whatsoever. Medieval humour was not delicate. It did not wink politely across the room. It arrived boldly, physically, and occasionally audibly. Long before wrestling matches or pig chases began, entertainment often started with words, and those words, especially in the popular comic poems known as fabliaux, were filled with tricksters, foolish husbands, greedy clergy, and jokes rooted unapologetically in bodily mishap. These stories were performed aloud in taverns and gatherings, and audiences did not shift uncomfortably in their seats. They leaned forward. The humour relied on humiliation, surprise, and the simple truth that the human body does not always cooperate with dignity. Laughter was not restrained. It rolled outward, echoing across wooden beams and open fields. Even royal courts shared this taste. During the reign of Henry II of England, a performer known as Roland the Farter was granted land for providing an annual Christmas performance that involved a jump, a whistle, and a carefully timed finale. The agreement appears in official records. It was not rumour, nor satire, nor folklore added later for effect. The same society that raised cathedral vaults toward heaven could also applaud festive flatulence in a candle-lit hall without perceiving contradiction. Medieval life contained multitudes, and that was merely the spoken portion of the festivities. When festival days arrived, often tied to the church calendar, following Easter, Whitsun, or the harvest or Oars, the village commons transformed. After Mass concluded and obligations were fulfilled, energy that had been contained all year spilled outward. Men and women who had spent months bent over fields or tending livestock suddenly stood upright and competitive, eager for something that was not work. For a brief window, survival loosened its grip. Animal chasing contests were one such release. In certain regions of England and northern France, a greased pig might be released into a crowd and whoever caught it kept it. To modern eyes, the spectacle looked suspiciously like chaos disguised as sport, yet to the participants it was opportunity. A captured pig meant meat through winter. The scene unfolded predictably, boots slipping, sleeves flapping, someone inevitably lunging too early, while neighbours shouted encouragement that was rarely helpful and frequently contradictory. The pig objected vigorously, the crowd objected louder. Dignity retreated to a safe distance. Wrestling matches followed, often between young men who had already decided they were evenly matched and needed public confirmation. Mud improved the drama, so did pride. Victories were celebrated for months. Defeats were remembered even longer. Tug-of-War ropes stretched across muddy trenches so that losing meant not only failure but immersion, a detail that enhanced audience satisfaction considerably. Stone-throwing contests tested raw strength, and foot races across uneven ground tested balance as much as speed. Bruises were common, applause was louder. Music threaded through everything. Drums and pipes cut sharply through the open air, fiddles repeating melodies that encouraged stamping rather than gliding. Dancing was communal, energetic, and only loosely choreographed, with wool tunics swinging wide and boots pounding rhythm into packed dirt. When the weather cooperated, dust rose in warm clouds under late afternoon light. When it did not, mud simply became part of the choreography. Either way, the village moved together. Yet beneath the laughter and spectacle lay structure. Archery contests, especially in England, were more than pastime. Laws required men to practice regularly, and festival competitions allowed skill to be displayed publicly. Targets were set at distances that demanded focus and strength, and a clean strike earned admiration that extended beyond the afternoon's amusement. A skilled archer might defend the village one day. thus recreation carried responsibility quietly within it. Mock battles served similar dual purposes. Young men armed with wooden staves reenacted skirmishes that tested reflexes and endurance. Spectators cheered, wagers changed hands discreetly, and bruises were worn like medals. Risk was not separated from entertainment. It enhanced it. A contest that left no mark was less memorable. Indoor leisure took over when winter narrowed daylight and fields rested under frost. Taverns glowed with firelight and thick ale poured into rough cups that dulled edge and hesitation alike. Dice clattered across wooden tables worn smooth by years of play, and board games such as tables, an ancestor of backgammon, offered competition that relied more on patience than muscle. Chess circulated among those who could afford carved pieces, though arguments over strategy could become nearly as heated as any wrestling match. Luck, in a world often governed by uncertainty, felt intoxicating. A fortunate throw suggested that fate might occasionally choose you. Storytelling filled long evenings as well. Around hearth fires, tales of wandering knights, mischievous spirits, saints performing improbable miracles, and neighbours behaving badly were told and retold until memory and exaggeration blurred comfortably together. Children listened wide-eyed, absorbing lessons disguised as ghosts. Adults laughed at familiar personalities thinly veiled behind fictional names. In an era when most people owned no books, spoken narrative stitched communities together. Certain festivals even allowed temporary inversion of hierarchy. During celebrations such as the Feast of Fools in parts of Europe, lower clergy or townspeople symbolically mocked authority figures. Roles softened briefly. Laughter travelled upward instead of downward. The inversion was temporary and controlled, yet it mattered deeply. It allowed tension to dissipate without dismantling structure. When we imagine the Middle Ages as unbroken severity, we overlook this determined pursuit of joy. Medieval people did not possess theatres with velvet seats or glowing screens to command their evenings. What they had were fields, taverns, livestock, music, stories, and one another. From these ingredients they created entertainment that was noisy, communal, occasionally reckless, and undeniably human. If you had stood at the edge of that 13th century square, hearing drums collide with laughter, watching villagers sprint through mud after a very determined pig, recalling a storyteller's bold punchline still echoing in your ears, you might have felt something unexpected. Not refinement, not gentleness, but vitality. For a few precious hours, the weight of survival lightened, and the village allowed itself to be loud, competitive, irreverent, and alive. Tomorrow the fields would call them back, but today someone had earned applause for impeccable timing, and someone else had caught the pig. If the wrestling matches and pig chases of a 12th century village felt chaotic, they were still mild compared to what happened when hierarchy itself loosened its belt. There were days in the High Middle Ages, especially in parts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, when social order briefly tilted sideways. During festivals such as the Feast of Fools, which emerged in the late 12th and 13th centuries, lower clergy would parody their superiors. Choir boys might mock bishops. Sermons could be delivered in exaggerated tones. Authority was not abolished, but it was gently set, and sometimes not so gently, and imitated. And imitation, as it turns out, can be very funny. The Feast of Fools was not universal, and church authorities often attempted to suppress its more unruly expressions, yet records show that in some cathedrals the atmosphere could become unexpectedly playful. Mock processions were staged, Donkeys were led into churches. Songs veered towards satire. In certain accounts, incense might be swung with theatrical enthusiasm rather than solemn restraint. It was in effect a sanctioned day of mischief within the walls of institutions otherwise defined by discipline. One can imagine the appeal. In a society where structure governed almost every interaction, who spoke first, who stood where, who owed what to whom, even a temporary reversal felt liberating. For a brief moment the rigid lines of medieval life blurred, and laughter moved upward instead of downward. The joke did not destroy authority, it reminded everyone that authority too was human. Outside church walls, other festivals allowed similar release. Harvest celebrations in the 12th and early 13th centuries often included processions, costumed figures, and games that deliberately exaggerated behaviour. Masks appeared in some regions. Performers played fools, animals, or caricatures of familiar village types. These characters did not whisper their humour. They exaggerated it. A foolish husband might be portrayed as so gullible he could be convinced his own boots were plotting against him. A boastful villager might be given a wooden sword far too large for his frame, waving it with theatrical menace before tripping over uneven ground. The crowd did not merely observe, they participated through laughter, commentary, and the occasional shouted suggestion. Food too became part of the spectacle. Medieval feasting in the 12th century, particularly during major religious festivals or manorial celebrations, was rarely delicate. In great halls, roasted meats were carried in with ceremony, but the eating itself could be enthusiastic. Bread trencher plates soaked with juices were consumed or discarded depending on status. Ale flowed steadily, and in some documented festive traditions, playful food throwing or competitive eating contests were not unheard of. The line between celebration and excess was thin. It is worth remembering that for much of the year meals were simple and measured. Bread, pottage, perhaps small amounts of salted meat. So when abundance appeared, restraint did not always accompany it. Laughter grew louder as plates emptied. Someone inevitably attempted to outdrink someone else. Someone inevitably regretted that attempt the following morning. Medieval entertainment also embraced physical spectacle in ways that modern audiences might find unsettling. Animal baiting, particularly bear baiting and bull baiting in later centuries, but with earlier roots in communal animal contests, drew crowds who were fascinated by displays of strength and unpredictability. In the High Middle Ages, while organised bear arenas were more common in later periods, villagers still gathered for rough animal contests that blended danger with curiosity. The appeal was not cruelty for its own sake, but confrontation with power. Watching an animal resist or dominate stirred something primal in the crowd. Mock executions and public punishments could also draw spectators. Justice in the early 12th and 13th centuries was visible. Stocks and pillories were placed in central spaces. While these were instruments of discipline, they became inevitably sites of social theatre. Onlookers commented freely. Insults were offered. Rotten vegetables occasionally found their mark. It was a harsh environment, yet it also reinforced communal boundaries. Participation, even as a heckler, reaffirmed belonging. And then there were games that defied easy categorization. In some regions, contests involved climbing greased poles to reach prizes tied at the top, an activity requiring equal parts balance, stubbornness, and a willingness to slide repeatedly back to the bottom while neighbours applauded. In others, groups of young men competed in mock hunts, chasing one another through fields with exaggerated stealth before collapsing into laughter when the quarry turned out to be less elusive than imagined. These activities were not polished. They were improvised within tradition. music continued to bind it all together. Travelling minstrels and jongleurs moved between villages and courts during the 12th and early 13th centuries, carrying stories, songs, and satirical verses. Their performances could shift tone rapidly, from heroic epics to comic tales involving clerics who perhaps should have been paying closer attention to their vows. Audiences appreciated both. It was entirely possible to admire the tale of Roland at Roncevaux, and then laugh at a story involving a poorly timed bodily mishap. Medieval taste did not require strict genre separation. What emerges from these scenes is not a society devoid of seriousness, but one that understood the necessity of release. The High Middle Ages were structured around obligation, feudal duty, agricultural cycles, religious observance. Entertainment created pockets of unpredictability. It allowed strength to be tested without warfare, authority to be mocked without rebellion, and abundance to be consumed without apology. If you stood in a 12th century village square during one of these festivals, you might witness a boy dressed as a mock bishop issuing playful decrees, a group of men sliding repeatedly down a greased pole with admirable persistence, and a minstrel concluding a comic tale with a punchline that would cause half the crowd to gasp before laughing anyway. You might smell roasting meat mingling with damp earth. You might hear drums echo against timbered houses. You would almost certainly hear laughter. Not refined, not restrained, but shared. And that laughter mattered. Because the next morning the fields would still need tending, obligations would return, hierarchies would straighten, the church would resume its solemn tone. But for a few hours in the High Middle Ages, in the early 12th or 13th century, beneath banners and mineral-painted icons, the world tilted just enough for ordinary people to breathe differently, not gently, but freely. By the time the pig had been caught, the mock bishop had issued his playful decrees, and half the village had tested its balance on a greased pole. One might assume medieval entertainment had exhausted its supply of creativity. It had not. The High Middle Ages, particularly in Western Europe between roughly 1100 and 1250, possessed a steady talent for inventing games that balanced skill with overconfidence, and occasionally rewarded the latter more generously than it deserved. Not all recreation required mud or livestock. Some of it required nerve. Archery, for example, was both obligation and opportunity. In 12th and 13th century England, men were expected to practice with the longbow, and communal shoots became occasions for competition as well as training. Targets were placed at challenging distances, often simple wooden discs or painted marks fixed against earthen banks. Success demanded steady hands and sharper focus than the previous evening's ale might allow. Villagers gathered to watch the arrows arc through open air, and there was a particular silence that fell just before impact, a silence immediately shattered by cheers if the mark was struck cleanly. There was humour here too, though quieter. Every village possessed at least one archer who believed deeply in his own legend. He might step forward with theatrical composure, draw the string slowly, and release with the confidence of a knight in a romance, only to watch his arrow drift decisively elsewhere. The crowd did not jeer cruelly. They laughed knowingly. Medieval recreation had a way of gently correcting pride. Throwing contests followed similar logic. Stones, weighted hammers, or improvised objects were hurled across open ground to test raw strength. Measurements were taken with boot-length estimates and exaggerated storytelling. No one needed precise yardage when there were witnesses eager to confirm that this year's throw had certainly surpassed last year's by at least a heroic margin. The exaggeration was part of the pleasure. Team games also appeared, particularly among younger men. Variants of early football, known in later centuries as mob football, though simpler forms existed earlier, involved two groups attempting to move an object toward a loosely defined goal. In the 12th and early 13th centuries, these contests were less formalised than later medieval versions, but ball games were documented in England and parts of France. The object might be a leather ball, occasionally inflated with animal bladder, and the rules were flexible enough to invite interpretation. Pushing, grappling, and strategic shouting were all considered acceptable tactics. What mattered most was not elegance but momentum. Spectators understood that chaos was inevitable. What began as a game could quickly resemble a very determined migration of bodies across a field, yet within the disorder there was structure. Alliances formed, rivalries simmered, skill revealed itself in sudden bursts, a clever feint, a well-timed sprint, a decisive shove that redirected the entire swarm. When a goal was finally achieved, celebration erupted with relief rather than refinement. Indoor competitions offered a different kind of intensity. Dice games were immensely popular across medieval Europe, and by the 12th century, authorities were already attempting to regulate excessive gambling. The appeal was obvious. Dice required no special strength or training, only nerve and the willingness to accept that fortune might humiliate you publicly. In taverns lit by firelight, the rattle of carved bone cubes on wooden tables became a familiar sound. Bets were placed in coin, in drink, sometimes in promises of future favours that might or might not be honoured. There was something uniquely medieval about trusting fate in this way. Life itself was uncertain, harvests failed, illness struck, weather shifted without warning, and so surrendering to chance for amusement felt strangely honest. A fortunate roll could elevate a farmer's mood as effectively as any sermon. An unfortunate roll might provoke groans and accusations of suspicious dice craftsmanship. Either way, the table drew a crowd. Board games offered a more measured form of rivalry. Chess had reached Western Europe by the High Middle Ages, adapted from earlier Islamic and Persian traditions. Its presence in the 12th and 13th century courts signalled education and status, yet it also carried narrative weight. Pieces represented kings, queens, knights, and bishops, miniature reflections of the social order outside the board. Matches could stretch on into the evening, with bystanders offering unsolicited strategic commentary. A bold move might be admired, an ill-considered sacrifice might be discussed for days. Tables, an ancestor of modern backgammon, was equally common and perhaps more democratic. It required calculation but allowed luck to intrude just enough to keep hope alive. In both games, concentration created a quieter form of drama. Faces leaned forward, fingers hovered. Victory was rarely silent. There were also competitions that blended absurdity with endurance. In parts of medieval Europe, contests required participants to balance awkward objects or perform repetitive feats under watchful eyes. Climbing poles, leaping over obstacles, or carrying weighted items across uneven ground were not unusual challenges. The appeal lay in persistence. The crowd admired stubbornness almost as much as success. A man who slid down a pole 5 times before finally reaching the prize was celebrated not merely for his grip but for his refusal to retreat. Even children participated in structured amusements. Simple chasing games, mimic hunts, and improvised contests with sticks and stones prepared them subtly for adult roles. Play mirrored expectation. Boys rehearsed bravery, girls practiced coordination and rhythm in dance and song. The boundary between preparation and pleasure was thin. What distinguishes these games from earlier festival chaos is their emphasis on skill. They required practice, awareness, and occasionally restraint. Humour still appeared, often in the gap between expectation and outcome, but it shared space with admiration. Medieval communities valued competence. Entertainment offered a public stage on which competence could be displayed, and yet, even here, the human element persisted. Overconfidence stumbled. Fortune misbehaved. A carefully planned move unravelled. The crowd responded not with cruelty but with recognition. In a world where hierarchy defined daily life, games offered rare opportunities for reversal. The strongest farmer could lose to a quieter neighbour. The confident archer could misjudge the wind. The seasoned gambler could watch his coins migrate across the table. Recreation, in the High Middle Ages, was not escapism in the modern sense. It did not transport people into fantasy worlds divorced from reality. Instead, it amplified reality. It tested skill already valued in daily life. It mocked pride gently. It rewarded perseverance. It allowed laughter to accompany failure without permanently damaging reputation. If you stood at the edge of a 12th century field during one of these competitions, you would notice something consistent beneath the noise and movement: attention. Villagers watched closely. They invested in outcomes. They debated tactics afterward. The games were temporary, but the memory of them lingered. Stories of remarkable throws, unlikely victories, or spectacular miscalculations circulated long after the field returned to quiet. By the end of the day, when sunlight angled low and shadows stretched across timbered houses, the competitions would slow. Dice would settle, boards would close, arrows would be collected. The village would exhale, having tested itself without war, risked pride without ruin, and discovered once again that skill, like humour, flourished best in company. Tomorrow work would resume with familiar weight, but tonight someone had proven, publicly and with witnesses, that they could hit the mark. If village entertainment in the early 12th century involved mud, livestock, and an alarming tolerance for public embarrassment, noble recreation attempted something quite different. It attempted dignity, attempted being the important word. In the High Middle Ages, particularly between 1100 and 1250 across England, northern France and the Holy Roman Empire, aristocratic leisure was carefully curated to appear elegant, disciplined, and worthy of lineage. Lords did not chase greased pigs through village squares. They hunted deer through forests with carefully bred hounds. The difference, one suspects, was mostly branding. Hunting was among the most prestigious noble entertainments. Forests were often legally restricted spaces, reserved for the elite. The right to hunt deer, boar, or stag signalled authority. A mounted procession would leave a castle at dawn, falcons perched on gloved wrists, hounds straining against leashes. Horns sounded through wooded valleys. The choreography mattered. The clothing mattered. Even the posture of the rider mattered. Everything was meant to project control. And yet, hunting retained its unpredictability. Boar were not particularly interested in aristocratic ceremony. A startled animal could charge with unnerving determination, and even armoured riders were not immune to injury. The hunt was thrilling precisely because it flirted with danger. Nobles framed it as mastery over nature. Nature occasionally disagreed. Falconry, however, represented refinement elevated almost to art. Training a hawk in the 12th century required patience, expertise, and resources. Birds were expensive. Equipment was specialised. The falconer had to understand behaviour, temperament, and timing. Watching a trained hawk rise, circle, and descend upon prey was considered both impressive and beautiful. It also required a certain confidence to stand calmly while a creature with sharp talons decided whether to return. Courtly entertainment also included music, poetry and performance. Troubadours and trouvères travelled through southern and northern France during the 12th and 13th centuries, composing and performing lyrical poetry centred on courtly love. These songs were not casual background music, they were intellectual exercises in metaphor and longing. Noble audiences appreciated subtle wordplay and elaborate romantic codes. Of course, the romance described in these poems was often more theoretical than practical. The idealized knight adored a distant lady with unwavering devotion, composing verses that praised her virtue while carefully avoiding direct scandal. Whether such restraint was always observed in real life is a question the sources treat diplomatically. Indoor leisure among the nobility often revolved around strategy rather than strength. Chess, introduced into Western Europe through earlier Islamic influence, became a favourite in courts of the 12th century. The game mirrored feudal hierarchy: kings, queens, bishops, knights. Victory required foresight and patience, qualities every ruler wished to claim. Losing, however, required composure, particularly when the opponent was younger, sharper, or quietly delighted. Unlike village dice games, which relied heavily on chance, chess allowed nobles to imagine that outcomes were earned rather than bestowed by fortune. Whether this belief always held true in politics is debatable. Feasting, too, took on theatrical form. Banquets in 12th and early 13th century castles were structured displays of wealth. Roasted meats were carried in ceremoniously. Bread trenchers lined long tables. Spices imported through expanding trade routes, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, signalled connection to distant worlds. The visual spectacle mattered as much as taste. A lord's generosity was measured by abundance. Yet even refined feasts could veer toward exuberance. Chroniclers occasionally describe guests who drank beyond prudence, musicians who played beyond moderation, and entertainers who pushed performance into comic exaggeration. Courtly dignity, it seems, required maintenance. Tournaments deserve brief attention here, though they grew more formalised in later centuries. In the 12th century, mounted competitions between knights were both training and spectacle. These events were not yet the highly regulated jousts of the late Middle Ages, but could resemble organised chaos on horseback. Knights charged in groups, testing skill and endurance. Armour clashed, lances splintered, reputation rode alongside risk. For spectators, tournaments offered something rare, a controlled display of violence without war. They were dangerous enough to be thrilling, but structured enough to be celebrated. A victorious knight gained prestige, a defeated one gained bruises and ideally experience. Intellectual amusements also occupied noble halls. Riddles, moral debates, and theological discussions provided stimulation for those with education. The High Middle Ages saw the growth of cathedral schools and early universities, and curiosity was not absent from aristocratic circles. A well-posed riddle could command attention as effectively as a hunting horn. What distinguishes noble entertainment from village recreation is not the absence of humour, but its tone. Where peasants laughed at physical mishap, nobles preferred irony, satire, and exaggerated courtesy. Yet the underlying human impulses were identical. Pride needed testing, skill needed display, authority needed reassurance. If you observed a 12th century castle during a feast, you would witness layered performance. A troubadour reciting verses of idealized love while guests quietly assessed one another's alliances. a falconer discussing the temperament of his hawk as though it were a philosopher, a knight recounting his latest tournament success with modesty that may not have been entirely authentic. Laughter, though quieter than in a village square, still travelled across stone walls, and when the torches burned low and guests withdrew, even nobles were not immune to the universal truth that entertainment is as much about relief as prestige. The hunt ended, the chessboard cleared, the falcon rested. For a few hours, obligation softened. Tomorrow, governance would resume. Forest laws would be enforced, letters sealed with wax would travel across territories, alliances would require negotiation. But tonight, a hawk had flown true, a knight had remained seated in his saddle, and a poet had convinced an entire hall that longing was noble. In the high Middle Ages, fun did not always wear mud on its boots. Sometimes it wore silk, and occasionally it still laughed. For most people living in the High Middle Ages between roughly 1100 and 1250, entertainment did not arrive quietly. It travelled by road, announced by distant drums or a reed pipe cutting through morning air, and when it reached a town square, ordinary routine paused almost instantly. Travelling entertainers, jongleurs, minstrels, acrobats, moved from settlement to settlement carrying instruments, stories, and an impressive tolerance for uncertain lodging. Their arrival transformed a market day into something more than trade. Annual fairs in regions of France, England, and the German lands were already gatherings of commerce, but performance added spectacle to exchange. Street entertainment was bold rather than subtle. A juggler might toss wooden balls or knives high enough to command attention from the edges of the crowd. An acrobat balanced on uneven cobblestones, while spectators collectively calculated how forgiving medieval medicine might be. Fire performers managed flame in open air, turning risk into choreography. Children edged forward first, adults followed more cautiously, though rarely with less curiosity. Storytelling expanded in scale at these gatherings. Performers dramatized romances, saintly legends, and exaggerated local tales, shifting voices and gestures so even those at the back could follow. A dragon might consist of cloth and poles animated by enthusiastic imagination. Realism was secondary to commitment. Applause followed effort as much as illusion. Religious drama also began to take more visible form during the 12th and early 13th centuries. Short plays based on biblical events were sometimes staged near churches during major feasts. These were structured presentations of familiar stories. Shepherds startled by angels, women approaching an empty tomb, yet embodiment gave them immediacy. Costumes appeared, dialogue expanded. Even solemn narratives gained liveliness when portrayed by neighbours, and inevitably someone cast as a devil seemed to enjoy the role perhaps more than intended. Fairs also introduced novelty through animals carried along expanding trade routes. A performing bear led by a handler, a monkey trained to mimic human gestures. For communities accustomed to livestock and familiar wildlife, such appearances felt extraordinary. Curiosity overcame hesitation quickly. The animal, for its part, did what it was trained to do while a crowd leaned closer. Music threaded through nearly all of it. Portable instruments, harps, lutes, pipes, drums, allowed performers to gather attention swiftly. Songs carried stories across regions, adapting slightly with each retelling. A melody heard in one town might resurface months later elsewhere, altered but recognizable, evidence of cultural movement long before printing presses standardized sound. Travelling entertainers occupied an ambiguous place in society. They were welcomed for their skill, yet regarded with mild suspicion. Their survival depended on reading a crowd carefully. Too solemn, and interest faded. Too bold, and offence followed. The balance required instinct sharpened by experience. Quick challenges sometimes emerged spontaneously. Who could recite a verse most convincingly? Who could hold a note longest? Who could imitate a familiar accent with enough exaggeration to provoke laughter without starting a feud? Pride hovered nearby, but so did amusement. Food added its own dimension. Roasted meats turned slowly over open flames. Honeyed pastries appeared in limited quantities. Spiced wine warmed hands when evenings cooled. Smells layered together, sweet, smoky, earthy, making the fare as much a sensory event as a visual one. As dusk approached, torchlight softened the edges of the square. Shadows stretched across timbered houses. Music slowed. Performers concluded with deliberate finales. A daring tumble, a sustained note, a final comic line delivered with confident timing. Applause lingered a moment longer than necessary, as though reluctant to release the atmosphere. Then, as quietly as routine allows, the entertainers prepared to move on. Instruments were packed, animals secured, wagons rolled out at dawn. The square returned to trade, and then to its usual rhythm. But the memory remained. For a few hours, villagers had witnessed unfamiliar stories, improbable feats, and creatures they might never see again. They had laughed together, gasped together, leaned forward in shared anticipation. In a world structured by obligation, such moments widened the horizon slightly. In the High Middle Ages, entertainment did not require permanence, it required arrival. And when the show came to town, even the most disciplined merchant or cautious farmer paused to watch, because routine can wait, but spectacle announces itself loudly. By the time winter settled across Western Europe in the early 12th and 13th centuries, the noise of fairs and outdoor contests faded into memory. Fields hardened under frost, roads grew unreliable, daylight shortened. Entertainment did not disappear, it simply moved closer to the fire. In the High Middle Ages, winter evenings reshaped leisure. After animals were secured and doors barred against cold wind, families gathered inside timbered homes where light came from hearth flame and tallow candles. Shadows leaned long against walls. The world felt smaller, and that smaller world required a different kind of amusement. Conversation became performance. Riddles circulated easily in medieval culture. They appear in manuscripts and oral traditions across England and the continent, and while some were devotional or symbolic, many were simply clever. A good riddle required layered thinking, patience, and an audience willing to argue about the answer. The pleasure was not only in solving it, but in watching someone else confidently solve it incorrectly. A villager might describe an object without naming it, something that speaks without a tongue or runs without feet. Guesses followed. Laughter followed the wrong ones. The right answer, when revealed, earned nods of appreciation that carried more warmth than the fire itself. Storytelling, too, softened in winter. Unlike the broad theatrical gestures of a fair, indoor tales were closer, more personal. Stories of saints still circulated, but so did quiet local legends. The traveller who lost his way in snow and followed a mysterious lantern home, the farmer who insisted he heard voices in the frozen woods. Children listened with serious faces that slowly gave way to relief when the ending resolved safely. Adults pretended not to be unsettled. Music indoors shifted tone as well. Harps and simple stringed instruments produced softer melodies suited to enclosed space. Songs carried history, devotion, and sometimes subtle humour. A lyric about courtly love could be sung earnestly one evening and slightly exaggerated the next, depending on the singer's mood. Performance did not always require spectacle, it required presence. Handcraft also filled hours that daylight once occupied. Spinning wool, carving small wooden objects, repairing tools. These were necessary tasks, but they also created space for conversation and light-hearted commentary. Someone's uneven stitching might invite gentle teasing. A carving that resembled its subject only vaguely might inspire speculation about whether the craftsman had ever seen the animal in question. Productivity and amusement overlapped naturally. Winter also brought simple physical games adapted to cold conditions. In regions where snow fell reliably, sliding down packed hills or testing balance on frozen ground provided entertainment that required little planning. The danger of slipping was understood, but so was the pleasure. Adults participated as readily as children, though with slightly more caution and occasionally less success. Feast days during winter carried their own rhythm. Christmas in the 12th and 13th centuries blended solemn observance with communal warmth. Candles multiplied, food improved temporarily, hymns filled stone churches and then echoed into homes. The season encouraged hospitality. Neighbours visited. Shared meals lengthened conversation. Even modest households attempted something special. A slightly sweeter bread, a rare spice saved carefully for this moment. Games of mimicry appeared in quieter forms as well. Family members might imitate local figures, respectfully exaggerated of course, for laughter that stayed safely within walls. The humour was affectionate rather than cruel. It acknowledged familiarity. The High Middle Ages were not technologically complex by modern standards, but ingenuity still surfaced indoors. Simple mechanical toys, carved whistles, or handmade dolls entertained children, while adults observed with mild amusement at the seriousness with which imaginary kingdoms were governed on dirt floors. What distinguishes winter leisure from earlier seasonal spectacle is its scale. It was intimate. There were no crowds pressing forward, no performers demanding attention. Instead, entertainment relied on shared memory and shared space. Each household became its own stage. And yet, even here, the larger medieval world intruded gently. News travelled slowly in winter, carried by travellers who braved frozen roads. When such visitors arrived, they brought stories from distant towns, a new market opening, a minor lord's dispute, perhaps even rumours of crusading campaigns far to the east. These reports were absorbed eagerly. The fire crackled while horizons widened. The tone of the winter amusement reveals something essential about the High Middle Ages. Joy did not depend solely on spectacle. It could be assembled quietly from conversation, creativity, and observation. Laughter did not always require a crowd. It required recognition, the shared understanding that someone's mispronounced word or misremembered lyric was harmless and deeply human. As nights lengthened, patience became part of leisure. There was time to listen fully, to debate gently, to sit in companionable silence while wind pressed against shutters. Entertainment did not demand constant novelty. It allowed repetition, familiar songs, familiar riddles, because familiarity itself comforted. When spring eventually returned and roads softened, outdoor energy would rise again. Fairs would resume. Performers would reappear. But winter offered something different: closeness. The High Middle Ages, often remembered for stone fortifications and rigid hierarchies, also contained small rooms warmed by shared breath and shared humour. If you stepped into one of those early 12th century homes on a cold evening, you might not witness spectacle. You would see faces lit by firelight, hear a riddle halfway through its telling, and notice someone attempting to suppress laughter at an answer that was almost correct. In that quiet space, entertainment was not loud, it was warm. For many people living in Western Europe between 1100 and 1250, the idea of travelling far from home was unusual. Most were born within sight of the same fields they would farm for decades. Roads were slow, uncertain, and often unnecessary. Unless, of course, the journey was holy. Pilgrimage in the High Middle Ages was framed as devotion, and it was. But it was also something else. It was movement in a world that rarely moved. It was novelty in lives structured by routine. For many ordinary people, it was the closest thing to adventure they would ever experience. Major routes led to shrines such as Canterbury in England or Santiago de Compostela in Spain, while countless regional saints' tombs drew travellers across France and the German lands. Pilgrims carried staffs, wore identifying badges, and joined roads that became unexpectedly lively during peak seasons. The journey itself formed a temporary community. Strangers walked side by side. A farmer from one region might share bread with a craftsman from another. Conversations unfolded easily when everyone faced the same horizon. Someone inevitably misjudged the distance to the next town. Someone confidently claimed a shortcut that proved optimistic. Laughter, even on a devotional path, travelled freely. Roadside inns and shelters became spaces of exchange. Travellers compared destinations and traded descriptions of distant shrines. For individuals accustomed to small villages, hearing about towering cathedrals or crowded urban streets felt expansive. Even minor details, unfamiliar spices in food, different styles of dress, unusual accents, became part of the experience. Markets along pilgrimage routes flourished. Vendors sold small badges or tokens depicting saints, which served both as devotional objects and as evidence of the journey. Returning home with such a token allowed a pilgrim to quietly demonstrate where they had been. The story naturally followed. The road also exposed travellers to broader public life. Larger towns offered busy marketplaces, musicians, and architecture that dwarfed rural buildings. A pilgrim accustomed to timber cottages might stand in awe before stone facades rising high above the street. The scale alone impressed. Not every moment was comfortable. Weather shifted unpredictably. Blisters were common. Yet even discomfort contributed to narrative. Medieval culture valued storytelling, and a returned pilgrim with tales of rainstorms, generous strangers, or unexpected obstacles held an attentive audience. Arrival at a shrine blended reverence with spectacle. Candles flickered against stone walls, hymns echoed, crowds gathered in shared intention. The sacred space carried solemn weight, yet the gathering itself felt momentous. Hundreds of individuals converged, bringing different dialects, clothing, and experiences into one place. Miracle stories circulated quickly. A traveller might recount a healing or a sudden improvement in fortune attributed to a saint's intercession. Whether such stories were embellished mattered less than the hope they carried. Pilgrimage offered reassurance alongside movement. There was also something subtly equalizing about the road. A labourer and a minor noble might walk the same muddy stretch, endure the same wind, and pause beneath the same sky. Hierarchy did not vanish, but it softened during shared travel. The return journey held its own quiet energy. Landscapes once unfamiliar became recognisable. Stories gathered along the way were refined for home audiences. Upon arrival, neighbours listened eagerly to descriptions of distant churches and crowded roads. The pilgrim badge displayed near the hearth confirmed the account. In a world defined by geographic stability, pilgrimage widened perspective. It allowed medieval people in the High Middle Ages to see beyond their immediate horizon and participate in something larger than their village. The journey was devotional, certainly, but it was also human, filled with conversation, minor miscalculations, shared meals, and steady footsteps. If you stood along a pilgrimage road in the early 13th century, you would not see spectacle in the theatrical sense. You would see anticipation. You would hear stories exchanged in passing. You would watch individuals who rarely travelled choose for a time to move, because sometimes in the High Middle Ages the greatest entertainment was not a performance, it was the simple act of going somewhere new, together. By the 12th and early 13th centuries, Western Europe had developed a particular appetite for wonder. Not loud chaos, not competition, not even structured performance. Wonder. In the High Middle Ages, curiosity itself was entertainment. People delighted in hearing about strange creatures, distant lands, and natural marvels that lay far beyond their village fields. For most, travel remained limited, but imagination travelled easily. Manuscripts known as bestiaries circulated among monasteries and noble households. These were illustrated collections describing animals, some real, some legendary, and the lessons they symbolized. Lions, eagles, serpents, and elephants appeared alongside unicorns, manticores, and creatures that modern zoology would politely decline to categorize. The appeal was not strict biological accuracy, it was meaning. A lion might represent Christ, a pelican might symbolize sacrifice. A unicorn, described as fierce yet capturable only by a maiden, became an allegory layered with interpretation. The images were painted in mineral pigments on parchment, flat and stylized, glowing in candlelight. Viewers did not ask whether the manticore truly existed in Persia. They asked what it meant. Stories of distant lands carried similar fascination. Medieval texts such as the writings attributed to John Mandeville would appear later in the 14th century, but even in the 12th and 13th centuries tales circulated of monstrous races said to inhabit the edges of the known world. People with dog heads, men with faces in their chests, lands where the sun burned differently. These stories blended classical sources, biblical interpretation, and traveller exaggeration, and audiences listened with genuine interest. To modern ears, such tales may sound implausible, but for medieval listeners, they expanded the world. If one rarely left one's own region, hearing about marvels was a form of mental travel. The unknown was not dismissed, it was entertained. Relics also contributed to this culture of wonder. Churches and monasteries across Europe preserved fragments believed to be associated with saints, bones, cloth, or objects linked to holy figures. During certain feast days, these relics were displayed publicly. Pilgrims and locals alike gathered to see them, not only for devotion, but for the experience of proximity to the extraordinary. Candles flickered, incense curled upward. The reliquary, often crafted from precious metal, shimmered. Even skeptics, if any stood present, would have acknowledged the theatrical power of the moment. Presentation mattered. The sacred was framed carefully. Nature itself provided spectacle. Unusual weather patterns, eclipses, or comets were interpreted as signs, but they were also events. chroniclers recorded eclipses with detail, noting reactions of fear, awe, or quiet contemplation. When the sky darkened unexpectedly at midday, it was not merely an astronomical occurrence, it was a communal experience. Markets occasionally amplified wonder further by displaying curiosities, unusually large animal bones, rare imported goods, intricate metalwork from distant regions. A merchant presenting a spice from the eastern Mediterranean was not only selling flavour, he was selling connection to a wider world. People gathered not simply to purchase, but to examine. Mechanical ingenuity, though limited by modern standards, also inspired admiration. Simple automata, small devices that move through hidden mechanisms, appeared occasionally in courts or wealthy households. A figurine that lifted an arm or a small structure that chimed at intervals was sufficient to draw attention. The mystery of movement created fascination. How did it work? Who built it? The answer mattered less than the shared amazement. What distinguishes this culture of wonder from earlier segments is its quiet tone. There was less shouting, fewer collisions. Instead, there was leaning forward, observing, asking. Humour remained present, though subtler. A storyteller describing a distant land might embellish just enough to invite raised eyebrows. A listener might nod solemnly while clearly deciding to repeat the tale later with improvements. Wonder and exaggeration were long-standing companions. In the High Middle Ages, curiosity did not undermine faith. It coexisted with it. People could marvel at a relic, contemplate a strange beast in a manuscript, and speculate about distant lands without perceiving contradiction. The world was wide, and knowledge was incomplete. That incompleteness created space for imagination. If you stood inside a 12th century monastic library and watched a monk turn the pages of an illuminated bestiary, you would see careful brushstrokes forming creatures both familiar and fantastical. If you stood in a cathedral during a relic display, you would see faces illuminated by candlelight, attentive and still. If you listened to a traveller describe lands beyond the sea, you would hear equal parts confidence and improvisation. Entertainment in the High Middle Ages was not confined to noise or spectacle. Sometimes it was simply the pleasure of encountering something unexpected, an image, a story, a sign in the sky, and allowing it to expand the edges of what felt possible. In a world without printed maps for every household, without images reproduced endlessly, each new account or object carried weight. The rare remained rare, the strange retained its power. And so, medieval people gathered not only to compete or laugh loudly, but also to wonder. Because even in an age defined by structure and obligation, the unknown remained irresistibly entertaining. When we look back at Western Europe between 1100 and 1250, the High Middle Ages of timbered villages, rising cathedrals, forest laws and crowded market roads, it is tempting to divide life neatly into categories. Work here, worship there, authority above, obedience below. But leisure does not fit neatly into those divisions. Entertainment in the High Middle Ages was not an escape from life. It was woven directly into it. The same people who laboured in fields, prayed in stone churches, and pledged loyalty to lords also gathered to laugh, compete, wonder, and travel. Recreation did not stand apart from responsibility. It moved alongside it. What makes medieval amusement so revealing is not its strangeness, though some aspects certainly appear unusual to modern eyes, but its consistency. Across villages and courts, indoors and outdoors, winter and summer, People sought moments that felt larger than routine. They sought noise when life was quiet. They sought quiet when life was loud. They sought novelty in a world that rarely shifted. In a society structured by hierarchy, entertainment offered flexibility, not rebellion, but relief. A contest allowed strength to speak where birth usually determined standing. A journey widened horizons beyond familiar fields. A shared story allowed neighbours to see one another not just as labourers or rivals, but as companions in imagination. There is something deeply human in that pattern. We often imagine medieval people as permanently serious, their days dominated by survival and faith. Yet the record tells a fuller story. They laughed, they teased, they exaggerated. They leaned forward when something unusual appeared. They argued gently over answers. They applauded effort. They admired skill. They sometimes overestimated their own abilities and were corrected publicly by gravity or weather. None of that diminishes their seriousness. It completes it. In the early 12th century, as Romanesque stone gradually gave way to the first Gothic arches, Europe was not static. Trade expanded. Towns grew. Ideas travelled through monasteries and courts. Even if an individual never journeyed far, the wider world crept closer each decade. Leisure reflected that expansion. Music shifted as melodies moved between regions. Stories adapted. Imported goods altered tastes. The appetite for novelty widened, and yet some constants endured. Entertainment was communal, rarely solitary, rarely private. It required witnesses. Whether in a crowded square or a quiet room warmed by a hearth, medieval recreation depended on shared presence. Laughter amplified in company. Wonder intensified in a group. Even quiet reflection gained meaning when others sat nearby. It also required memory. Without printed programs or recorded performances, medieval entertainment lived in retelling. The story of a remarkable journey improved each time it was narrated. A clever riddle resurfaced season after season. A surprising moment, whether humorous or impressive, lingered because people carried it in their minds and voices. The act of remembering became part of the amusement. There was also an honesty to medieval leisure. Risk was visible, effort was visible, skill was visible. A person's success or failure unfolded in real time, before neighbours who would not soon forget it. Reputation could rise or wobble within a single afternoon. That visibility created tension, but it also created authenticity. There were no hidden filters, only participation. Even quiet curiosity carried weight. When someone encountered an unusual object, a striking image, or a story of distant lands, the reaction was not dismissal but engagement. The unknown was examined, interpreted, woven into worldview. Wonder was allowed to breathe. Perhaps that is what feels most distant from modern life. Today, novelty is constant and easily replaced. In the High Middle Ages, novelty was rare. It lingered. It mattered. A new melody might echo for months. A distant tale might circulate for years. The first glimpse of something unfamiliar might shape memory. And yet, for all the differences, the impulses remain recognizable. People still gather. They still compete. They still travel in search of meaning. They still laugh at misjudged confidence and admire well-timed skill. They still lean forward when something strange appears and whisper about what it might mean. Medieval leisure was not primitive. It was contextual. It grew from a world defined by physical proximity, seasonal rhythm, and limited mobility. Its forms were shaped by available materials: wood, wool, stone, parchment, voice. But its emotional core was identical to ours: connection. When villagers assembled in a square, when nobles gathered in a hall, when travellers shared bread along a road, they were doing more than filling idle hours. They were reinforcing belonging. They were confirming that life, though demanding, contained space for shared experience. The High Middle Ages were an age of obligation to land, to lord, to church. But within that structure, space existed for laughter, admiration, curiosity, and gentle rivalry. Entertainment did not erase hardship. It softened it. If you stood at the edge of a medieval settlement at dusk, somewhere in England, France, or the German lands between 1100 and 1250, you would hear voices carrying through air thick with smoke from cooking fires. You might hear a melody drifting from within a timbered house. You might see neighbours lingering slightly longer than necessary before parting. In those moments, leisure was not spectacle, it was affirmation. Life was difficult, seasons were uncertain, authority was firm. Yet people carved out moments that felt expansive, moments that reminded them they were not alone. And perhaps that is the truest measure of medieval entertainment. Not how strange it appears from a distance, but how familiar it feels up close.